Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Eric Schwartz, the president of Refugees International, and it is a real pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar. I wanted to first say how delighted I am to assume the position of president of Refugees International. I've been in the job now for about 3.5 weeks, and it's been exciting and exhilarating, and I'm very as eager as I can possibly be and excited as I possibly can be about this wonderful organization whose sole purpose is to advocate on behalf of refugees and displaced persons and the principles of international humanitarianism. Today we are, delighted to welcome our senior advocate for human rights, Dan Sullivan. Dan has recently completed a mission to Bangladesh where he looked at the situation of Rohingya refugees who have been forced to flee Myanmar, also known as Burma. And this issue has been a source of ongoing concern for Refugees International. And today, I believe, we've issued Dan's report on the situation confronting Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. So let me say a few words about Dan Sullivan, and then I will turn the floor over to Dan. Dan joined RI in April of 2016 as a senior advocate focusing on Burma, Central America, and other areas impacted by mass displacement. He spent the 5 years before coming to RI with United to End Genocide, and first as a senior policy analyst, then as director of policy and government relations, leading strategic planning, report writing, and the development of policy recommendations on Burma, South Sudan, Syria, and the prevention of genocide and mass atrocities. Dan has a decade of human rights and foreign policy experience. Perhaps most notably, there's so many notable achievements on Dan's resume, but I think it's worth saying that Dan assisted former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright in her role as co-chair of an important genocide prevention task force some years ago. So with that very brief introduction, it is my pleasure to introduce to you all Dan Sullivan.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to everyone who is joining this webinar. Very excited, as Eric said, the report from my recent mission just came out today. So I encourage you all to take a look at that. It's available on our website. But I'm going to go through a lot of what's in that today, and going to go through a series of slides that'll give you some sense of what I saw when I was there, and just give you a sense of what's going on today in Bangladesh as well as in Myanmar. So this is based on a trip I took at the end of May, and it's the reason I wanted to look at this was in October of 2016 there was mass violence that happened within Myanmar that caused over 70,000 Rohingya to flee the country across the border into Bangladesh. And there's been a lot of attention on what happened within Myanmar, even though the government of Myanmar has blocked access. There have been numerous reports by the UN and by other human rights groups that have independently talked to Rohingya who fled violence and found all kinds of horrible things happening, destruction of villages, torture, mass rapes, enough to prompt the UN Human Rights Council to call for a fact-finding mission. And that's something that's ongoing. The government of Myanmar has refused that so far, so that's something that we're pushing on. But there has been a lot of attention, and there should be, and there will be continue to be attention at what happened in Myanmar, but less attention on what that has caused, what the influx of 70,000 new Rohingya into Bangladesh has done for the humanitarian situation, and for the situation of other Rohingya who already are in Bangladesh. So that's a little bit of the background of why we took this mission. And let me just say, I'll be taking questions at the end, and if during this webinar something comes to mind, please enter it through the chat box you'll see on the side of your screen. So I traveled to several places in Bangladesh, which is just across the border from Myanmar, where Rohingya refugees and what are called unrecognized or undocumented Myanmar nationals, where they have fled to, and this is something that's been going on for many years. And I had a chance to talk to people who have stayed anywhere from arriving just a few days before to people who have been in Bangladesh for over 20 years. And one thing that I want to mention was I traveled with Toon Kin, who is himself Rohingya, and he is an advocate based in the UK now. But he, as we were traveling, it was probably one of the most emotional parts of a very emotional trip, was where he came the closest he's been to his homeland, to his village where he grew up, in 18 years. So it just gives you a sense of how long this has been going on, and that in addition to the most recent violence and people who have fled, this has been going on a really long time. There are more Rohingya who have fled to Bangladesh than any other country from Myanmar. And today there are as many as 500,000 Rohingya who are living in Bangladesh. So you had that already. And of those, the government of Bangladesh has been reluctant to recognize them as refugees. And in fact, only 33,000 are officially recognized as refugees and living in just 2 camps in Bangladesh. So what that means is that the rest of the population is basically they're not recognized as refugees, and they're stateless because the government of Myanmar refuses to recognize Rohingya as citizens. And then you add to that, since October, more than 74,000 what they call new arrivals of Rohingya, and they're joining places where it's already been crowded conditions, tough conditions, where shelters that are very vulnerable to the monsoon season, the high winds, to intense heat in the summer, which is when we were there. And the initial reaction by the government of Myanmar for this new group of 74,000 plus to come in was to go back to the worst kind of reactions we've seen, where they closed off the borders and they actually sent back thousands of people on who were trying to come across on boats. Eventually that improved, and several people were, the 74,000 were allowed in. And the government has been making significant efforts in recent years, and particularly in recent months, to better address the humanitarian situation of Rohingya in the country. But clearly there are several gaps that are remaining. So I spoke with dozens of Rohingya, as I mentioned, and several who had been there for just as little as a few days, many just in recent months. And they told me about what were their most pressing needs. And number one of all of those was food. People were getting some emergency food, but it wasn't enough. And there were also problems with emergency food going almost exclusively to the new arrivals, whereas there were other Rohingya who had been there longer who also had needs. So that's something that the humanitarian community with the government is trying to address, but it continues to be the number one thing that any Rohingya I spoke to in the country brought up was food. The second, and I alluded to this earlier, is shelter. These structures that they live in are very hot in the summer. They can get colder, and are most vulnerable during the monsoon season, which has already begun and will go through October. And closely behind that, you have issues of health, where, with this influx of refugees, there have been outbreaks of different kinds of diseases and threats of things getting worse. There's partially a positive story on the health front in that the government has worked well with international non-governmental organizations to increase shots that are given to help protect the Rohingya, and that could be a model for helping things in the future. And then another big need was education, where again there's an imbalance in how much education is allowed for the 33,000 official refugees and the non-recognized. For on the best of cases, there's no path for higher education, and so when you have a situation that's been going on for over 20 years, two official camps, more than half of the populations were born in those camps and grew up. So education is a really important thing as well. I want to really highlight, and I do in my report, the issue of protection. The Rohingya in Bangladesh may be safer, and this is the title of the report: "Safe but Not Secure in Bangladesh." There are all kinds of threats going on with human trafficking, with gender-based violence. And one of the telling statistics is that of the new arrivals who arrived since October, 57% of them are children, and 80% are either women or children. The problem is that beyond those official camps, just the 33,000, among the 200 to 500,000 others, and particularly among the new arrivals, there is no police presence, and there is no camp management kind of structure. There's UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, which usually takes the lead in providing protection, is not permitted to work anywhere beyond those two official camps. So the vast majority of the Rohingya in Bangladesh are not getting the protection that they need. And one of the most tragic stories I heard was not long before I got there. There was in one of the camps a brutal gang rape of a 10-year-old girl, and the mother, to her credit and her strength, was going to the authorities and trying to fight that, but really facing an uphill battle. And so that's something that needs to be addressed, and something that UNHCR and others want to do more to address. Amid this, there are some new opportunities. As I mentioned, the government has been working on a strategy with the international humanitarians to increase and better the structure of the humanitarian response. And the government carried out for the first time a census last summer of the Rohingya who are in the country. And perhaps most importantly, the government of Bangladesh at the UN Leader Summit on refugees last fall made a pledge to provide information cards to the Rohingya who are in Bangladesh, and those cards are important because they will provide some protections and some access to basic services that they don't get right now. The bad part, as I said, was that UNHCR's mandate to beyond the camps continues to be limited, and there are some indications of going back to the worst practices of the past. Perhaps most notoriously, the suggestion of moving Rohingya in Bangladesh to an uninhabited island that is actually prone to flooding most of the year. So that's been largely condemned by the international community, but it continues to surface from the government of Bangladesh. Now, in addition to all the challenges I've laid out that the Rohingya who are in Bangladesh face, There's also something in particular that the new arrivals face, and that is very recent trauma, and that comes both in physical form and in mental form. Physically, humanitarian aid workers that I spoke with talked about an increase in the number of wounds that they had to treat, the numbers of reported sexual violence. And the picture that you see on your screen now was one boy that I spoke with who had a stab wound and had to flee. And there are several other testimonials that I took, and we Refugees International also earlier this week put out a policy brief focusing on Rohingya in Myanmar, and that includes several of the testimonials that I received while I was there from people who had fled violence in Myanmar in recent months and even in recent days, showing that even though the official military crackdown in Myanmar has officially ended, there continues to be violence. So, and I also mentioned the mental trauma that's happening. Humanitarian aid workers that I spoke with also talked about how they had to treat a lot more stress, people not being able to sleep, having nightmares, and children refusing to eat, all from the memories that they have. And a lot of these camps and settlements where the Rohingya have fled are very close to the border, so they can actually see their homelands, and that has a huge effect on them. And as one woman told me, remembering is a kind of disease. So you have this trauma that they're facing that adds to all of the other challenges that Rohingya are already facing in Bangladesh. Now, I just want to give a couple of concluding remarks, and then I want to open up to questions, and then give you a few recommendations that came out of this trip. But I just put up a shot of Balukali makeshift settlement, which is the newest. This didn't exist, before the October violence. This consists of all new arrivals who have just tried to find any kind of open land. And you can see it's on a hillside and prone to mudslides and terrain. And in fact, 2 days after I returned from my mission, Cyclone Mora hit and destroyed or damaged 80% or more of the camps, of the makeshift settlements, and the official camps. Did significant damage to hospitals there as well. But Balukali was one of the hardest hit. So it just reinforces the need for more durable kind of materials to be used for the building of the materials, and having some stockpiled resources. So as I mentioned, the shelters, that's you can see that most of them are made out of mud, out of bamboo and sticks and string, and not really in line with the best practices of what should be done for displaced persons. And running through a few of the recommendations, there are several recommendations in the report, and I encourage everyone to look at those. But I just want to highlight a few. First, just for the government of Bangladesh, expanding protection services to the Rohingya in the country is very, very important. And the easiest way to do that is to expand the mandate of UNHCR so that it can go beyond the camps. But in addition, as I mentioned earlier, there needs to be a police presence. And with a police presence, of course, there comes fears from the Rohingya community and the risk of abuse. So there should also be clear camp management structures and ways that the Rohingya can report if there are any kind of abuses happening, and they should have access to the legal system. That's something that the constitution in Bangladesh actually provides for, that there should be legal services to anybody in the country, and that should include Rohingya. The second main recommendation to the government of Bangladesh is to lift the restrictions on durable building materials. And I spoke about that earlier, and you saw from the pictures, it's really important, especially as the monsoon season continues for the next several months. And then the third was providing those information cards that can provide key protections for the Rohingya in Bangladesh. And that's something that, it will come out of this census process that has happened. And I was told that could happen, the census results could be released anytime in the coming weeks. So it's really important that that be done, and that we move forward with these information cards, and eventually, in the long term, some type of permanent identification cards that give the Rohingya status. And then for the United States government, two key recommendations. One is that there should be provision of additional funding to address the most immediate needs faced by the Rohingya, and those especially include food assistance, shelter, and health, but also gender-based violence and human trafficking, which I mentioned earlier. And just to underscore, several of the humanitarian officials I spoke with said that there's not enough information right now on the extent of the human trafficking networks and the risk, but there have already been several cases of missing children and women taken into the sex trade. So and what these officials told me is they really believe that what they see now is just the tip of the iceberg. So there's a lot more that needs to be done on that for protection. And then the last one, which I think is very important because it brings it back to the root causes here of what the Rohingya are facing, is that the government of the United States needs to press the government of Myanmar and needs to link any further enhancements in the U.S.-Myanmar relationship to concrete and verifiable progress, particularly on accountability. I mentioned earlier the fact-finding mission of the UN Human Rights Council that the government of Myanmar so far has refused to allow visas for. That's something that just cannot be accepted. Also the safe return of Rohingya to Rakhine State, and ultimately a path to citizenship. The government of Myanmar should reform its outdated citizenship law, and citizenship laws that is not in line with international standards. It was set up in 1982 by the military government at the time, and it's time to reform that. So I just want to end on the story of just how long-term this has been. How I mentioned earlier the two official camps with the 33,000 officially recognized refugees, where more than half of them were born in the camps and have lived their whole lives there. That should be a stark example for what's going to happen if we don't address what's happened most recently with the 70,000 plus who have come into the country, and also that the 500,000 that remain in the country. And, I think it was put very well by one official, humanitarian official, aid worker I spoke with, who said, their trauma is not over. They need some hope, need to know they are not forgotten by the international community. So that's something that we're trying to do with this report and with our advocacy. And I'm really thankful for your interest in this and in your interest. And I'll end it right there. And thank you again for joining. And please let me know if there are any questions. Okay, so I'm seeing one right here that says, why hasn't Aung San Suu Kyi fulfilled expectations that came with her election? So that's a great question. Aung San Suu Kyi is the Nobel Peace Prize winner who spent the better part of 2 decades in house arrest in Myanmar, and now is the effective leader. So there were a lot of expectations for her to defend the rights of people, and including the Rohingya. The answer's not clear. I think on one side there's a lot of restraints on what Aung San Suu Kyi can do, because the military maintains a lot of influence within the country. But that said, and I will say that the military holds the primary responsibility for the attacks that have happened. But that said, Aung San Suu Kyi has not spoken out against them. She's more defended the military and has refused to allow people to come in, and most recently this fact-finding mission. So it's it's not really clear, and it's frustrating to a lot of rights activists, advocates, that she's not doing more. But I think that as you continue, international pressure and attention continues, that's going to help to push her to do more. And I do give her credit for appointing a international advisory commission to deal with what's going on in Rakhine State, where most of the Rohingya live, which is headed by Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General. So they came out with an interim report, and they'll have their final report at the end of August. We are submitting our report to that commission, and we really hope that that's something that can help come up with practical solutions. Okay, and seeing another question here. What can the United States do to pressure Myanmar to end the violence targeting Rohingya? The United States has been working closely with the government of Myanmar towards opening things up, and has lifted sanctions in recent years. And the relationship between the United States and the government of Myanmar is something that's important to the leadership in Myanmar and important to Aung San Suu Kyi. So continuing to raise issues of human rights, and showing that any progress on further cooperation, and in particular any kind of military to military cooperation, is really going to have to depend on the end to abuses by the military. And that's something that it's not always clear. It seems fairly obvious that, you shouldn't have further military to military cooperation when these awful things are happening, but it's something that the United States should be very clear on with the government of Myanmar. And then I would say working with the other countries in the region, including the government of Bangladesh, to put pressure on the government of Myanmar to address the citizenship issue and free and unfettered humanitarian access. So I think that's it for now. I encourage everyone to go to our website, refugeesinternational.org, and you can find this trip report, and as well as a policy brief we did earlier this week on what's happening within Myanmar itself and what our other recommendations are. But I want to thank everyone for joining. And one final technical note is that you'll all be receiving an invitation to take a survey on how this went. So we welcome your feedback. And again, thank you everyone for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.